Hey, beloved Evergreen English high school students. This is video number 5 for Elements of Literature. Mr. Hebert coming at you. Hopefully you have some good notes going and keep those good notes going through this video here. So just to recap, we have looked at setting, we have looked at protagonist and antagonist, we have looked at conflict, we have looked at character types with round dynamic characters, flat static characters, and agents. We have also looked at point of view and the 3 major types of point of view: first person, third person omniscient, and third person limited. So now we're moving on, and kind of related to character types but a little bit different, and this idea of characterization. And characterization basically means how we get to know these characters. What is it that the authors use in literature for us to get a sense of their personality traits, what they're feeling, what their characters are like. And this is going to be through things that they say and things that they do and things that they think about, and also what other characters say and do. And basically there are 2 types of characterization. Again, this is having to do with how do we get to know this character. In the same way, how you get to know your friends. How do you get to know what your friend's character is like, what their personality is like? You know it by what they say, what they do, the thoughts that they share, the effects that they have on other people. And in written literature, there's a couple of different ways. The first type is direct characterization. Direct characterization means the author just tells us directly, openly, telling the reader what the character's personality trait is, what that emotion is. So there's no reading between the lines here. There's no inference. It's right there on the page. The patient boy and quiet girl were both well-mannered and did not disobey their mother. So what do we know about the boy and the girl? The author tells us directly these personality traits. The boy is patient. Where's patient? Right there on the page. What is the girl like? She's quiet. What are they both like? Well-mannered. It's right there in the passage. Now, it may sound like we're dumbing this down a little bit, but no, it's just a tool. There are lots of tools that authors use, and it's just like a toolbox. There's lots of different tools in the toolbox, and it depends on the scenario, it depends on the situation that requires a different kind of tool. So sometimes it's more effective to be direct in the characterization, and sometimes it's effective to be indirect with that characterization. And that gets us to the second type, and that's indirect. So direct characterization is openly telling us. Indirect is openly showing us about that. And notice this list here because it helps us to remember the acronym. We get to know these character traits through the speech, what they say, the thoughts, the effects on other characters, actions, what they do, and looks, like facial expressions or sometimes physical appearance. So if you look at speech, thoughts, effects on other characters, actions, and looks, it gives us a nice little acronym of STEAL. Speech, their thoughts, their effects on other characters, the actions that they do, their behavior, and their looks. So looks would be facial expressions, and in some cases physical appearances. The effects on other characters, please pay attention to that, because sometimes we get to know about a character through what other characters think about them, what they say about them, how they respond to that character. So STEAL is a nice little acronym to help remember indirect characterization. I'm not trying to endorse any criminal behavior. It's just an easy word to work with that. I guess we could have done stale, but this sounds more action-packed. So don't read too much into that. So let's look at an example of indirect characterization. We saw an example of direct characterization. And as we read this, I want you to be thinking, what is the author showing about Stan? Because the author doesn't just come out and say this personality trait, this character trait. It's using these other elements of indirect characterization. So what's the author showing about Stan? Stanley's eyes blazed as he surveyed the room. The corners of his mouth pointed in a decidedly southerly direction. Carol moved aside as he stalked past her. "Look out for Stan," she whispered to Bart. "He's in another one of his moods. I'd stay far away if I were you." Okay, so what is the author showing about Stan? Take a moment, think about it. If you want to talk to me through the wonderful computer world, I'd be happy to hear you. What is the author showing about Stan? Well, Stan's a guy who gets angry a lot. Apparently he loses his temper and he takes it out on people. And look at the phrases, the indirect characterization that the author uses here. Stanley's eyes blazed. Right? That's a good example of looks and facial expressions as he surveyed the room. He didn't just look at the room, he surveyed it. Right? Kind of like scanning for targets. The corners of his mouth pointed in a decidedly southerly direction. So he's frowning and has that kind of look on his face. His effect on other characters. Carol has to move aside as he stalked past her. He didn't just go past her, he stalked like he's looking for prey. And again, look at the effect on other characters. Look out for Stan. She whispered to Bart. Right? She has to whisper because if she spoke any louder, it would set off Stan. He's in another one of his moods. Apparently this happens a lot. I'd stay far away if I were you. So without showing that or telling us that he has a temper, it shows us. Now, many writing teachers, many writing professors will talk about that showing is more effective than telling. And it definitely is more sensory. It uses a lot of visual imagery. It uses a lot of emotions. It is very compelling. I will say this, though. There is a time and place for every type of tool in literature. So we're going to analyze indirect characterization. We're going to analyze direct characterization. And in your own writing, we're going to be practicing both. It does take a little more time and practice to do indirect characterization because you have to look at other details. So just giving you that heads up. Now, what characterization examples do we see from our Three Little Pigs story? Well, we have direct characterization. How do we know the wolf is bad? It just tells us. One night, the big bad wolf tells us directly. Another example of direct characterization. But the wolf was a sly old wolf. It tells us that personality trait. It openly, directly tells us that he is sly. Indirect characterization. So what is this showing about the first little pig? The first little pig built his house out of straw because it was the easiest thing to do. Well, it doesn't say openly that he's lazy, but it shows that he is lazy. Why? Because he just goes for the easiest thing to do. It's your house, for goodness sake. You're going to be living in it. You got to keep out wolves. You'd think you'd put in a little bit more time. I don't know. He's lazy, overconfident. There's all sorts of things we can draw from that. An indirect piece of characterization, when the pig says to the wolf outside the door, "Not by the hair of my chinny chin chin," said the little pig. Again, he's talking to a big bad wolf, a creature that's much larger than him who wants to and can eat him alive. So he's kind of shoving it back in his face. What does that show about him? That he's overconfident, maybe that he's brave, maybe he's standing up to him in a moral good way. Either way, it's indirectly showing this character trait. The last example here, indirect. The little pig saw the wolf climb up on the roof and lit a roaring fire in the fireplace and placed on it a large kettle of water. So what does this show about him? There's a wolf coming in, and what does he do? He quickly acts. He takes something that he has in the house and comes up with a plan to take out the wolf. He doesn't go running for his life. He doesn't say, "Ha, you're stuck up there," and then he goes off into the meadow. No. So he uses different items around him to solve problems. This is showing that he's resourceful. He's paying attention to what's happening outside. He's perceptive. He is clever and cunning in coming up with a plan that's going to take out the wolf in a dramatic way. So he doesn't use those words, resourceful, perceptive, or cunning, but from that one description, he is showing us a particular character trait about this pig. So that's direct and indirect characterization. Imagery. Imagery is a word that's kind of thrown around a lot, and at some point you kind of have to say, okay, is everything imagery? Maybe. Is it only some things? Maybe. Because it's kind of vague, so I'm just going to be open and telling you that. So imagery, called descriptive language sometimes, or just sensory language because it invokes the five senses or our emotions. Things in how it's describing something, the way it looks, or describing the way it sounds, or describing the way that it feels. It's kind of a catch-all phrase for descriptive language. Sometimes imagery has to do with adding symbolism or a deeper meaning to it. It's sometimes referred to vivid language that paints a picture in the reader's mind. I can really see it, can draw into that. And indirect characterization definitely is more imagery driven than direct characterization. Therefore, as I was just saying, it involves the reader more instead of just telling him or her what's happening. The two cars had a collision. Yes, I can describe that, and there would be a time and place for that kind of description. Or I might get into all of the details, the sounds and the sights and the smells and the touch of that kind of experience. And imagery can overlap with other types of devices. We may talk about figurative language. It might be imagery that involves similes, metaphors, personification, and those are just a few examples. This is not an exhaustive list. Similes, as you hopefully know, are comparisons using like or as. A metaphor is using a comparison using the word is. And personification means giving human qualities, especially human emotions and personality traits, to non-human things. So some examples of imagery. It was dark and dim in the forest. The children were screaming and shouting in the fields. He whiffed the aroma of brewed coffee. These bullet points aren't meant to go together, so don't try to read it as a story. Otherwise, that'd be a really weird story. The girl ran her hands on a soft satin fabric. So instead of just saying she touched some fabric, she ran her hands, as you can see her hand gliding across, palm down, not just on the fabric, it's soft and satin. If you ever touched any fabric like that, you can feel that smoothness of the fabric. The fresh, juicy oranges are very cold and sweet. So fresh and juicy, cold and sweet. Some good adjectives there to bring out that description. I don't have any examples on this about imagery with symbolism, but as we get into different pieces of literature, we definitely will see that example. These are some other examples of imagery. I'm going to pause for a moment. If you need to pause the video, I want you to read all of these. Yes, you're in high school. You can read all of them. And again, just get a sense of how it's showing more than telling. All right, I'm going to assume that you have paused and read all of these. I do trust that you are following directions. That's how we respect the process. All right, thank you. And some good ones there. Another example of imagery, we've referred to Romeo and Juliet a couple of times. This is when Romeo is looking at Juliet in the Capulet party. He is seeing her for the first time, and he's just overcome with love, and he thinks she's so beautiful. He uses a lot of imagery, kind of an extended metaphor here. He compares Juliet to light. In fact, it's a symbol, it's an image that he uses again in the famous balcony scene when he's talking about the comparing her to light because she just pushes away the darkness. So he's looking at her at the balcony there. Oh, she doth teach the torches to burn bright. It seems she hangs upon the cheek of night like a rich jewel in an Ethiop's ear. So she's so bright, she's so wonderful, her goodness is so amazing. It's so light-filled that she teaches torches how to burn bright, and that in night she hangs like a rich jewel in an Ethiop's ear, just standing out like a bright shining gem in the middle of the night. Powerful imagery. Our next device has to do with tone and mood, and they are related, but they are not the same thing. So tone has to do with what the author is doing. That's where we got Hemingway there on the left. He's doing the writing. And mood has to do with the reader. So tone is how the author chooses to present his or her work. It's the emotion of the text, and the mood is the feeling that the reader gets from the work. So it's always in terms of emotions. And you might think, well, aren't they exactly the same thing? If Hemingway writes a sad story, isn't it going to make me feel sad? Well, maybe. But there are situations, and we will talk about this in class. We're going to do an activity with tone and mood. There are situations in which the tone of the text is not the same, or it usually is not the same as the mood it presents to the reader. So we just think of tone is the emotion of the text, T-tone, T-text. Mood is the emotion it creates in me. Mood, me. Tone, text, mood, me.